Hey, welcome everyone to Unfiltered, Real Church Planting Discussions. My name's Stephenson, and I have the privilege of overseeing our national movement of church planting for Converge. And along with me is Danny.
I'm Danny Parmelee, and I'm with Converge Mid-America and oversee church planting for that region.
Awesome. We are excited today to begin just taking some time to talk about kind of key questions that I think every church planter somewhere wrestles. I mean, the reality is there's numerous amount of questions that we can answer. But, we've taken some time to really focus on what I think are 5 critical questions that every church planter, probably every church planting spouse is asking the same questions. And we're just going to take some time, wrestle along with you in these questions, but try to give you some perspective as well as you may be wrestling with this right now in your current life situation. Question number 1 is that question, is how do I get paid? Okay, maybe you're ready to go. You feel like we got a green light from assessment. Now it's like everything, the money hits the road here is how do I actually make a living? How do I support myself? How do I support my family? Whether or not you're coming out of the business world or whether or not you're coming out of a staff role at another church. What was your wrestle with this, Danny, and how did God answer that? What advice would you give to somebody that may be wrestling with that right now?
Yeah, well, I think if those of you out there that are not familiar with church planting, maybe you think the answer is you don't get paid. And I wouldn't suggest that. I would actually say that is not, maybe the most even biblical and definitely not the most healthy way to kind of approach it. Or people would say, I'm just going to save up all of my own money. I recently talked to a guy who says, hey, I really feel called to church planting. I agreed. I said, I think you have some of those building blocks. Let's send you an assessment. He says, well, I'm going to work on staff at this church for 3 years, and I'm going to save up $100,000 so I can just use my own money to plant this church. And I'm like, well, let's talk through this a little bit, because that, again, might even point to a bit of self-reliance. Because if God has called you to plant a church, He's also going to provide.
Great point.
And while there's lots of different ways in which God does provide and can provide, what we have found to work the best is that church planters raise financial support, and that they actually get funding set in place before they even begin the process of developing a launch team and before opening the doors of the church. So a lot of church planters think, okay, well, my paycheck is tied to when the doors open and I collect an offering that day, which you have this huge ramp-up period time, so that would mean you wouldn't get paid during that time. And then the other thing I tell guys is you may open the doors, but don't think that there's going to
the money's going to come
a full salary. And especially if you are truly planting a church that's trying to reach non-believers, counting on those offerings as being your paycheck can be a really, really dangerous thing. So not that we'll cover all of it here today, but raising financial support. And it is probably one of the biggest faith journey of your life to raise that support, but God uses it. It's not a necessary evil. I think that's a real important thing. It's something that I think God really even just builds into the whole process of trusting Him. And the reality is if you're called as a church planter, you're going to be in a lead position. You're going to be raising funds and resources for the rest of your life in that role. It might look different, but you will always be fundraising.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And when I think about the fundraising aspect, one of the markers of a successful church plant, and multiple groups, including Converge, kind of use this as one of their fundamental, hey, you made it, is when your church becomes self-funding. When did you guys, when you planted the church, how long did it actually take you to become self-funding as a church?
Yeah. So we were year 3.
Okay.
And that's a pretty, as I coach church planners now, I say raise funds.
Were you lazy or? No.
For 3 to 4 years, because that's usually, and depending on the context. Urban areas, it can take 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah.
Certain suburban contexts, it can be a year. There's some plants, and depending, and we'll get into some of the model stuff, can be self-sustaining on day one. I just tell guys to not count on it.
Yeah.
And we were able to, so we raised financial support for 4 years. We became self-sustaining at year 3. So we were able to write to our financial supporters and say, hey, guess what? God's provided, no longer need your financial support. And they said, well, we've never had that before where someone, and people gave more money because they just thought that was so great.
It's winning, yeah.
And I did not turn that money away. We just used it, we used it for other things. But it usually, it takes a while. And that goes back to what I said before about, if you're reaching non-believers, and even if a believer comes to your church, I think the average they say is between 12 to 18 months before they begin tithing and giving significantly.
And I would say even just tithing, that's probably even fast. Maybe they become a giver or percentage giver, but to go, unless God usually does some pretty major work, it's going to take a little while for them to give up 10% of their income. I know for us, it was 2.5 years before we became self-funding as a church, and I just see that routinely in church plants. That it's 2 to 4 years that a church planter is going to be working to get the church up to the size in which it can truly be totally self-funding as a church. Yeah,
I'd love to share our story. So our first year's annual offering was $11,000 year. Not month, not week. That was the entire year, and we were, predominantly college students and young professionals and non-believers. And so, it took a while, and we did things on the cheap. But the advantage is that because I had raised financial support from outside supporters, I didn't have that pressure, and it really, this is another reason why I say I've become a fan or that I'm passionate about raising financial support is I could do what God had called me to do in planting the church without having to worry about the money. So if I had to make a hard decision and it was going to affect someone who was giving at the church, which I shared our numbers already, every single person counted, I could still lead in that because I knew that God was still going to provide for me and for my family. So one of the things that I would say, and again, each denomination and even within Converge, each district does it a little bit different, but what's been important for us is that we sit down with the planter and we establish their salary package and then have them raise that. So it's not just this number,
random
kind
numbers,
of random and especially it's going to be different. One part of the state, you could even say in one part of the city and compared to another part of the city, size of family, all these different things, and to sit down with a planter and to find out what is that healthy number. So one that's not too low that the family you're starving, you can't take vacations, your children can't be involved, but that it's also not high that as you are planting the church and people begin to know your salary and they think, man, you're way overpaid here. It can be a negative, or that it takes that much longer for you to do the support. So we don't dictate a number. We sit down with the planter and figure that out together. We use different matrix and grid to kind of figure that out, but it is really a conversation.
I'd be curious. Let's take a moment. What are some of the metrics that you do use to help define that? So if people are sitting there going, man, that's a great idea, but I don't even know where to start. Give us some starting points that you've used that have been successful for you.
Yes. So when I started, we did look at annual teacher salary.
Okay.
So that worked, at least in our context, to say, hey, well, here's what someone who's getting a teacher salary. But again, you've got
first-year teacher to tenure
teacher, all of those different things. You got insurance stuff, and again, depending on the district. But at least it's kind of a baseline. And then again, it helped me in my own leadership when people are like, hey, how do you get paid? How much you get paid? I say, hey, I just took the annual teacher salary to be able to do that. The other thing that we use is that I think Church Staffing is the one that puts it out, but they print a pretty big book that kind of just looks at regionally size of church, but again, for a
Leadership Network.
Or Leadership Network.
Leadership Network does that.
So that's kind of helpful. Now, if they're in a church right now, we kind of look at their salary and just their budget and where they're at right now is also kind of a helpful thing. Now, if they're coming out of corporate America, and again, they're getting paid, oodles of money and bonuses, which we've had. We've had guys that have left very lucrative jobs to be able to become a church planter. there's no way that it would even be
yeah.
healthy to do that. And that conversation, of course, was had before they made that decision. But looking at those family needs, so those are some of the different ones that we at least use to start the discussion. How
No,
about
that's
you?
great. We've very similar. We look at what the local school districts are paying, teachers all the way up to principal levels. We look at local health care, salary systems, cost of living.
Yeah.
So we just look at what are the home prices in this area. To live above the poverty line, what would you have to make in order to be able to live in the a median size house in that community, and out of that kind of begin to put some numbers again. If you have relationships in those cities, it's great to be able to pull upon pastors that already live there, and get their feedback of what are they sensing is going on in the community. What is the typical pastor salary of the area as well, and then you take all those numbers and kind of come up with a number that's agreeable for both parties, in essence, to be able to live upon. I do find that one of the bigger challenges is the health
insurance.
And
Absolutely.
I mean, we've looked at every option out there, and I wish I could say that, hey, just do this. I can't. They're just not. It's not clean. It's a messy process right now. I would say just look at the gamut of different healthcare providers that's out there for you, and just find what works best in your case scenario.
Yeah. So I think there's kind of three of the major options or routes that I've seen church planners take. The ideal one is if your wife works and she has a great insurance
She works
package,
for the hospital.
She works for the hospital, and you can add that on. But there's a danger to that as well too. If all of a sudden she's feeling the pressure to carry the insurance, and God hasn't called her to that. A lot of our plans are using the SHARE program, so Samaritan's Ministries, and that's what I used as a planter all the way up until I transitioned into this role. So that was helpful because it's really all that we could afford, and even as a church, even as our church got larger, health insurance was just so expensive, even in group policy stuff. So Samaritan's Ministries, MediShare, I think there's a couple other big ones to kind of explore that. But then, looking at the different insurance programs are out there, but man, it's expensive and not a lot of coverage.
And most group insurance, you need to have at least 5 employees.
Yep.
And so most church planters aren't going to be in a position to be able to afford the group. And the challenge is then maternity. If you're going into individual, making sure that you have a maternity coverage as well. Because most planters are young, and they may be in that process of thinking of expanding their family at that time as well. But I know both of us can talk from personal experience. God always gave us enough.
Yeah.
And there were moments and there were months where you're sitting there going, I don't know how we're going to pay this bill. Somehow it always worked out. We live faithfully, and I would say not just faithfully, but live generously ourselves.
Yeah.
God honors that, and this is just one of those steps of faith. But you don't need to sacrifice your family. Don't sacrifice those type of pieces for this. I think God will open the right doors if you're willing to ask and have those key conversations to be able to raise the finances needed to make this church get up and running.
Yep, absolutely. That was our thing once we had set our salary and raised financial support. Never missed a paycheck, and just really thankful for God's provision in that area. Yeah,
fantastic. The second question that I see, let me go back. The financial thing is such a big thing. We're going to do multiple episodes later talking about the finance specifics to fundraising, how to do it, what are keys to it. Unique things that guys are doing around the nation to help in that process as well. And so tune back later for more information on that. But the second question I want us talk a little bit about is I hear a lot of guys go, now that we feel called to plant, how do I transition? And that's a pretty major and broad question, because you're going to have some people that they're on staff of a church that this is the vision of the church, and they are planning for this. They're excited for this, and they're working alongside of you to figure out a healthy transition, both to help create momentum for the new church, but also it creates momentum for the existing church. Then you have other people that are in positions where maybe the church doesn't know or they don't want this to happen. and that makes it a little stickier of a transition. You also have people that are transitioning maybe from the corporate world into a church situation. Those transitions can all be difficult. I know one guy that he started a church. He was in the corporate world. The corporation did background checks on their employees, found that he had a second side business, and they didn't like that. They saw it as a conflict of interest, which I don't know how you could see it as a conflict of interest, but they basically said, choose one or the other.
Yeah.
And it put them in a spot where they had to walk away from corporate America to do the church plant. It was a major financial hit for them as well. But talk from your perspective, Danny. What have you seen work well in transitions? What have you seen not work well?
Yeah. I think that, let me speak to the ministry one. If you're in a ministry, the thing that works well is a lot of communication, everybody being on the same page, and clear expectations. Because I think that what happens is sometimes there are these unintentional threats and insecurities that come out either by the planter or by the church and the ministry. And if people were able to get into the rooms, just express and be honest and authentic, say, hey, well, this is what I'm scared may happen, especially for like a church. They may be nervous that this plant, that even though they love you as the planter, they're nervous that if you go out and plant, they're going to lose a whole bunch of people from their church, and they see that as loss of people, loss of money, a threat to their own types of things. So then they make certain decisions or talk about it in a certain way, and then you get upset because of the way that they're handling it. So your counter thing is to have secret meetings and do all of this. So getting in the room and to start having those discussions. And I think that the key to it is both people looking for that kind of win-win situation. Because
to quote Stephen Covey, the brilliant man. Yes.
You can, because if God is in it and God is multiplying His church, people are being reached for Christ and disciples being raised up, it is a win-win situation. You just have to figure out how it is and what this looks like. How can this be a win for everybody, even the congregation members themselves?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely, and I think that, to reiterate, clarity is so important in this. And if you can get things in writing even ahead of time of how are we going to handle these type of situations if they were to arise, it just helps both sides, both parties, to be able to navigate some of those perspective rapids that are going to creep up as you're moving down the road.
Do you want to speak to a few of those? Like, what are some of the things that you see as being fears from the church who is losing the planter, and then how can a planter say, well, even be proactive when they kind of have that conversation?
Yeah. I think if you can bring clarity as to who you have permission to talk to about joining the movement and who you don't. Some pastors will be, hey, you can talk to anybody. Other pastors will be like, you can't talk to anybody. And so if you can get that clarity ahead of time, very, very helpful. If you could sit down and talk about even hard conversations like financial support. Will this church financially be supportive of the church? If so, how much? Again, this kind of goes back to question number one. You have a natural opportunity. You've been on staff. Should be a loved connection there. If you can use that relationship to help embolden and create some financial support, that's going to be incredibly helpful.
Give me so what should a planter do? Because we all want them to say, hey, you can take anybody with that you want. What advice do you have for a planter who the pastor says, listen, I'm for you, but honestly, I don't want you to take anybody from the church. How should they respond?
I think you have to look at how can we honor the relationship. It's again, you don't trust man, you trust God, and sometimes you can look at it and go, oh, well, we're sunk already. No, you're not. The reality is, I hope you're planning a church to reach those in the community that are far from God. Like that really should be the driving factor. There will be people that God will bring in your midst that will support you, maybe within the church or outside the church. The reality is you don't want everybody. You don't want to talk to everybody. And if the pastor assigns, hey, you can talk to these two couples, you want to make sure that they're the right two couples that he's not just trying to get rid of.
Right.
But I think it is rare. I think church planning is getting enough recognition that a lot of pastors are realizing this is an area that they can be generous and God will guide them. Now you're going to still run into some situations that are going to be tough. But I think you got to honor the relationship and honor the authority that God has placed in their life at that point. There are going to be people that just because of relationship, maybe years that you've been on staff, that are going to be wanting to know what you're doing. Hopefully the church would at least be able to honor you, maybe stand you up front and say, hey, so-and-so is going to go plant a church, and if you'd like to know more, you can go talk to them. And then you just use your relationship and say, hey, we're planting this church, and we're going to begin to gather and, and just take questions from that. And I don't think that that's dishonorable if your heart's right in the way that you go about that.
Yeah, I think that's so great. I think just that key principle of how you honor them, because it's true, they don't own anybody. But you don't own anybody either. And people eventually will make those decisions. So don't just say yes to that and go, okay, I won't talk to anyone, but really behind the scenes, you're like, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you because a pastor is working for Satan.
Yeah, exactly.
But instead, because God will bless integrity and character. So even when someone is maybe being driven by fear or ego or insecurity, the more that you honor them and that relationship and you walk in that, I think that God will honor and bless that, whether that's people from that church or from somewhere else. So I think that's such a good word, just to have that as a principle. And if as a church planter, you may even be leading the person that's in authority by your leadership, by what you're demonstrating.
And people will notice. And I mean, I was on staff of a church and ended up having to transition out of that role. And we planted a church about 12 miles or so down the road. Now it was two different freeways, so it felt like a totally different area of town. But we had to really clarify our understanding, the relationship, expectations on both sides. And there was just a mutual respect there. And I'm very thankful it went very smoothly as through that process. And I'll actually talk more about that later on when we talk about how to build a launch team and that relationship with a parenting church, and how do you build a launch team? Who do you take? Who do you not take? And we worked really hard relationally, in the lead pastor of that church and myself, to make sure that was done well. The next kind of key question that I think a lot of planters wrestle with is, how's this going to affect my family? That's a very real, it's a very raw question that I think we have to take some time and address in this episode. Now, I know for you and Emily, you planted the church pre-kids.
Yep.
How did it affect, let's talk from that perspective first. How did it affect your marriage early on? Yeah. How did it affect the home dynamics when kids were introduced as well?
Yeah. So I think our situation is unique. I had shared a little bit before that Emily was shyer, had a little bit of hesitancy of church planning and what her role would be. And because of that, she kind of got really started in her career the same time that the church plant was getting going. And we've actually reflected on this a lot over just the last couple of years of saying we were kind of living almost two separate lives. I was working as hard as I could at the church plant. She was working as hard as she could at her career. And then we would come home and have dinner together, type of thing. And almost living two separate lives and not even really realizing it and recognizing it until later on. And definitely then when we had our first child, so that would have been, I think, about 5 years into the plant, then that's where I think those things began to kind of surface for that. So in ours, it was a little bit unique because we didn't have kids, and because of my personality and her personality, we just kind of both went head first into our own kind of thing.
Great. Yeah, I know for us, we planted. We had one child. He was 2, and our second child came along a couple years after we were into the church. I think it helped for us. We had a different perspective kind of going this, both of us being pastors' kids, kind of understanding intuitively some things about the church world. It's still challenging. I mean, yes, we went through financial challenges. There's the challenge of people, and I think for us, it was bonding for us to be able to walk through some of those things together, and to be able to, at least I knew somebody else was feeling the highs and the lows at the same time I was, and we could pray through those things together. We could talk about honestly, and I felt like it balanced us out well. If she is having a low day, I was probably having a better day, and so I could help her out, and flip flop. When I was having a bad day, she was probably having a better day, and we'd be able to talk that. I know for my kids, it was a great experience for them in those early days. I mean, we started in a movie theater. My son still talks favorably about going to movie church, and loved that experience, and he loved the attention as a young kid of being the pastor's kid. I think as the church got larger, it got easier for my kids though too, and that not everybody knew who they were, and so you do as a pastor and as a planter, you do have to protect your family and protect your wife, because the polls, everybody may, they look to the wife to get things done. I don't know if you saw this, but I know people would go to Melissa as a means to getting to me. And I don't know, maybe it's because I am too intimidating, or my look is different. Yes, there you go. But my wife, I mean, she's small, she's blonde, she's a whole lot prettier than me, that she's less threatening. And so people would come to her, and I had to train her how to have key conversations and be able to say, well, I don't know, talk to Lee, but those were hard things that we had to learn to navigate in those early years, and we just had to communicate and be constantly communicating, because I'd see her frustration rise when people would constantly come to her about things she had no idea about, and so I had to learn to lead her through that process as well.
And did Melissa work when you planted, or was she working, not working part-time?
I would say she cleaned homes. On the side to help make a little bit of extra money, but it was, wasn't a business. It wasn't, she did it on her own. It was more a few people that she had close relationship with.
For us, once Stella was born, and because our church was probably just transitioning at that point from being only college students and young professionals to people starting to have children, she grew up loving it. Same reason. She looks back at that time, and yes, she loved being the center of attention and being able to get up on stage and be the star of the Christmas program. And not because she was a star, but she was one of the only kids that we had. So,
by default, you win.
By default. And and maybe our situation, I mean, we had good experiences in our church plan, so our kids look favorably on it. It may be different for others that maybe they're in a challenging, church plan or church situation. But for us, the kids absolutely. Absolutely loved it. So
that's great. That's great. I think the biggest advice I could give to a planter is just stay in tune with your family. And I find oftentimes your wife is the thermostat. She understands what needs to be tweaked or where it needs to go, and don't ignore those things. Don't ignore your kids. You definitely don't sacrifice your kids for the life of the church. You got to pay attention to it, and it's easy to get out of balance if you're not focused and intentional.
Right. Without being legalistic, what are some of the things that you put in place that helped guard?
Great question. One of the biggest things I found was I had to put the cell phone away. I had a knack, I'd walk in the door at the end of the day, coming in for dinner, and I'm still on the phone. I'm still, either emailing, texting, in a phone call, and my kids would run up to me, excited to see me, and I'd almost ignore them. And my wife helped me see what I was doing to the family dynamics, and I made a very intentional decision at that point. Even if I'm driving home, because most days I'd be driving, I'm talking on the phone, I'd stay in the car, in the driveway until that phone call was over. Then I'd shut the phone off, I'd walk in, I'd be present, I'd literally walk over to a certain drawer in our kitchen, I'd put my phone in the drawer and close the drawer. And so it allowed me to be present with my family. And I found that that was very, very helpful early on. I really took a Sabbath. As hard as it is in those early days, and as hard as you feel like you just got to go in order to make this happen, I found if I didn't care for myself physically and my emotional and my spiritual health, really, i.e. a Sabbath rest, I was no good to my family, I was no good to me, I was no good to the church. And so that was critical. I've always been an advocate for exercising. And so that helped me deal with stress of what was going on. It was a natural release. And so I've always kept a pretty stringent exercise routine for years through the planting. And I was unapologetic about it. I put it on the calendar and I kept it. And usually it was 4:30 in the afternoon. And so from 4:30 to 5:30, I was working out. I was burning off the stress of the day.
How much can you bench press? I'm just kidding. You don't have to answer that, even though it's unfiltered here. So
enough. So yeah, I maxed out at 365.
There you go. Wow,
so
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, sweet. Yeah, I think those boundaries are great. Same lessons learned here. I certainly wasn't always perfect at it, but I would have to even stop like a street down, because as soon as that car pulled in, the kids are sitting there looking in the window type of thing. And then same with Sabbath too. And that was a constant battle, and always had my wife to remind me of that. So now when I coach church planners, instead of asking them if they keep their Sabbath, I either say, how does your wife think that you keep your Sabbath, or asking them directly, because it usually is the wife that will give the honest answer. And that is usually representative of how they're kind of just generally shepherding and taking care of their family.
That's great. Well, we've got a couple more questions that we're going to get to in the next episode of Unfiltered, and so I want to invite you to come back, join us for that. It's been real, and in the meantime, keep it real, guys.